data types exist in JavaScript and what is the difference between primitive and reference types?
Primitive data types: numbers, string, Boolean values, undefined indicates that the variable has not been assigned a value. Null indicates that the absence of a value. Symbols. Reference data types: objects, arrays, functions. The difference between them is that primitive data types are stored directly in the variable, while reference types are stored in a separated memory area, and the variable contains a reference to that area.
How to make a copy of a one-dimensional array?
Using the slice method, using the concat method, using the spread operator, using the array point from method.
What is the difference between abstract classes and regular classes and interfaces?
Regular classes can be instantiated as objects, while abstract classes cannot. Abstract classes can contain methods without implementation, which must be defined in subclasses.
What does NaN refer to? Is there such a data type? What does NaN stand for?
NAND stands for not a number, and it is used to represent errors when performing arithmetic operations on non-numeric values. It is not a data type, but a special value of the number type.
How to get NaN?
You can get none, for example, dividing by 0, or by attempting to convert a non-numeric string into a number.
What will happen if you perform a mathematical operation with a string?
When you perform a mathematical operation with a string, the string will be automatically converted to a number, if possible. Otherwise, NaN, not a number, will be returned.
How do primitives differ from non-primitives?
Primitives, such as numbers, string, Boolean values, are simple data types that are stored directly in the variables. Non-primitives, objects, functions, are composite data types that store reference to memory locations where their values are stored.
If you write type of array in the console, what will you get?
If you write type of array in the browser console, you will get undefined. This is because array is an undefined identifier in JavaScript unless we have defined it earlier. If you do the same in JavaScript program code, you will get the value object, because in JavaScript arrays are specific type of object.
How can two objects be compared?
Several comparison methods. Deep comparison. Iteration all properties of object and comparing their values. You need to implement this logic yourself, or to use a library, such as Lodash, with its equal method. Second, string comparison. Conversion object to JSON string and comparing the resulting strings.
What looping options are available for objects?
To iterate over an object properties, you can use several methods. For in loop. This loop is used to iterate over all enumerable properties of an object. Object keys. This method returns an array of key-value pairs for each own enumerable property of the object. Object entries. This method returns an array of strings containing the names of all properties of the object. Object getOnProperties names. This method returns an array of strings containing the names of all properties of the object.
How do variables declared with let, const, and var differ?
Let and const are block scope variables, while var has functional scope. Const is used to declare variables whose values do not change after assignment.
Can multiple variables be created with a single keyword let or const?
Yes, you can declare multiple variables with a single keyword let or const by separating them with commas. However, for const, each variable must be initialized with a value at the time of declaration, and their values cannot be changed afterward.
Can you write const A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3? Will this construction work?
Yes, you can. It will work.
What nuances exist regarding variable hoisting and scope?
The nuances of variable hoisting and scope in JavaScript are related to the differences between declaring variables with var, let, and const. Variables declared with var are hoisted to the top of their scope, but are not initialized until that point. They remain in the undefined state, and console log with them will output undefined. Variables declared with let and const are also hoisted to the top, but remain in the temporal dead zone until they are declared. Attempting to access them before initialization will result in a reference error.
Which variables does hoisting apply to? Let, const, and var.
Hoisting of variables applies to the scope of the current function or block of code in which they are declared. This applies to all types of variables, var, let, and const.
What is the term for the scope enclosed by curly braces?
This area is called block scope or lexical scope.
If you declare multiple variables using var, one at the beginning and another at the end, can you reference these variables in the middle?
Yes, when declaring variables using var, you can reference them anywhere within the block in which they are declared, even before the actual declaration.
What are the types of scopes? What additional scope exists in the browser context?
Global scope. Variables declared outside of all functions have global scope, and they are accessible from any part of the code. Functional scope. Variables declared inside a function have its scope limited to that function. They are inaccessible outside of that function. Block scope. Variables declared inside a block of code, for example with curly braces, have scope limited to that block. This applies to variables declared with let and const. In the context of a browser, there is also a scope associated with the window object, which contains all global variables and functions.
How do you understand closure?
Closure in JavaScript is a function that has access to its outer function scope, even after the outer function has finished executing. Closure is also a way of accessing and managing external variables from within a function. The simplest example of closure is when you declare a function and within that function you declare another function. Even though the inner function has its own block scope, it can still access the variables of the outer function in which it was declared. This way, their context is enclosure. In this way, we can use both our own variables inside the function and the parent context. Based on this principle, you can create your own reduce function.
What is type narrowing?
Type narrowing is the process of reducing the range of permissible values of variables using type checking or other checks in the code.
How can you split a string into characters?
To split a string into characters, you can use the method split, which will divide the string into an array of characters.
The for, a loop in JavaScript. What can it be applied to? Obviously, to arrays. What else can it be applied to? What are the requirements for the object?
The for-of loop in JavaScript is used to iterate over elements of iterable object, such as arrays and string. It's correct to say so, because an array and a string are specific cases of object, and that they have iterators. The requirement for an object to be used with the for-of loop is that it must have iterators. More detailed, if a custom object is created, it needs to have the symbol point iterator method added to it.
Have you heard anything about the dead zone?
The dead zone in JavaScript refers to a temporary period in the scope of variable, when the variable exists but has not been initialized with a value. This occurs when using variables with the keywords let and const before they have been declared in the code. In JavaScript, variables declared with var are hoisted to the top of their scope, but remain undefined until they are actually initialized. In newer ECMAScript standards, starting from ECMAScript 6, also known as ES 2050, a new concept called the dead zone was introduced. This concept is associated with the lexical scope of variables, declared with let and const, and restricts access to them until they are actually declared in the code.
There's a task to clone an object. What would you do? What are the possible ways to clone objects?
To clone objects in JavaScript, you can use various methods, such as the spread operator, object assign, JSON parse, JSON stringify, or utilize existing libraries like Lodash.
Why does Lodash have a separate function for cloning objects? Why not just use JSON.stringify? Are there any negatives?
Lodash has a separate function for cloning objects because JSON.stringify cannot properly handle references to functions and other native objects. This can lead to data loss or errors during cloning.
Have you heard that there's a new native method in JS? In one of the latest versions of ECMAScript, a function for copying structured clone objects has appeared.
In what VG HTML Living Standard specification, a native method structured clone has been added for deep cloning objects. However, to use it, you need to employ concepts such as web workers, service worker, or shared worker.
If we use the spread operator to destructure an object, do we need to write a function to prevent the copying of references? The spread operator copies references, correct? Is it particular at the top level?
Yes, if the object contains nested references, then the spread operator only copies the top level of the object. Therefore, to avoid copying references to nested objects and deeply clone the object, you can manually describe all nested objects using the spread operator for each of them. This is possible if the structure of the object is known in advance, or if it is necessary to precisely Determine which properties of the object should be deeply copied. Perform deep copying using recursive functions. Use JSON stringify and JSON parse functions. Use third-party libraries such as Lodash.
There is an event loop in JS. Could you tell me about it?
The event loop in JavaScript manages the execution order of code in single-threaded environment and handles asynchronous operations such as execution callbacks and processing events.
Can you provide an example of microtask? How to create a microtask?
An example of microtask can be a promise in JavaScript. A microtask is created when the then or catch method of a promise is called.
Is it possible to open a second thread in JavaScript?
JavaScript does not have native support for multi-threading, but there is a ways to emulate multi-threading using web workers.
Do you have an understanding of how microservices work?
Each microservice is developed as a separate application using JavaScript or Node.js. Microservices communicate with each other through network requests, often using standard protocols such as HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or AMQP, Advanced Messaging Queuing Protocol.